It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Dr. Alexander Robel. He's an assistant professor, part of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And we're going to talk about his research. Alexander, thanks for coming.
Great. It's great to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background, and then we'll get into your current research.
Sure. So I am born and raised Floridian. I grew up in Miami, Florida, sort of raised by a first-generation immigrant to the United States from Latin America. And really growing up, I had an interest in science from an early age. And for me, what that looked like is I definitely had an interest in sort of nature and the natural world and, weather and meteorology, that sort of stuff. But I've always been very interested in sort of the puzzle that are problems that we encounter in nature. And so how do we explain natural phenomenon that we see in the real world? And then how do we build ways for reliably explaining and predicting those phenomena? And so through really early part of my education, I went to a science magnet public high school, the Miami public school system, and then went from there. So that was where I really first encountered scientific research, where I had a sort of after-school job at a NOAA federal laboratory that was a half a mile walk from my school. And that really got me into scientific research. From there, I went on to Duke, where I was an undergrad in physics and earth sciences. And at that time, I still kind of entertained the possibility that I might do traditional physics. But once I got more of a taste for academic research in earth sciences, I knew that was the path that I wanted to take. So after that, so in undergrad, I had started doing research in oceanography and hurricane meteorology, which was a bit more, let's say, suited to my background, being from Miami and having had a lot of childhood experiences with hurricanes, Katrina, Andrew, Wilma, and many others. But there was sort of a serendipitous set of events that led me to a PhD advisor, Elliot Sieperman at Harvard, who works on a wide range of problems in climate science. And one of the problems that he was interested in at the time that I started my PhD was on how glaciers that are embedded within ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, why they flow fast and what could cause them to change the speed of their flow on timescales of sort of decades to centuries. And so that really started, my engagement with glaciology, which is a sort of sub-discipline of earth sciences where we study glaciers and ice and how they change when the climate changes. And from there, that's really what I've studied ever since. I would say in recent years, studying glaciers and ice sheets for me has also started to look more like, what the effect of changes in glaciers and ice sheets is, right? And so when glaciers and ice sheets start to melt, or when the climate changes, and, how quickly do they start to melt? And then how does that create problems for people in coastal communities like the one that I grew up in trying to plan for the future and, trying to build resilient communities.
So you focus on glaciers, from, that are next to the ocean, or do you focus on them from lakes, like freshwater ones or saltwater, or what's your, or do you focus on all glaciers?
I'm kind of a dilettante when it comes to glaciology in that I work on any problem, any scientific question having to do with glaciers and ice sheets that's interesting to me. Some of that is, glaciers like in Greenland and Antarctica or Alaska that are in contact with the ocean. Those tend to be the biggest ones, right? And the ones that are changing the most quickly. But I've also worked on the problem of melt on the surface of glaciers, and also what's going on beneath glaciers where they are in contact with the solid earth, with the ground.
What are some of the differences between a glacier that, is next to the ocean? Is the ice, does it have a higher salt content, different structure than a freshwater one? Like, what are the major differences you've seen?
Yeah, so the content or the sort of composition of glaciers is not that different between those that, we call them land terminating glaciers. So terminate on land, and they might terminate in a lake, but that's different than a glacier that terminates in, the ocean, the salty ocean. The composition is ultimately not that different, and that's because the composition of glacier ice is determined by the snow that falls on top of them. And so this is actually kind of backing up one major distinction is between what we call glaciers or ice sheets, which are masses of ice that have formed due to snowfall or persistent snowfall over many, many thousands of years typically in one location. And that snow over time piles up and compresses into ice. And so the composition of glaciers and ice sheets then is really reflecting the composition of the snow that made them. And that is distinct from what we would call sea ice. And so sea ice is the relatively thin layer of ice that forms at the top of the ocean in winter in the near the North Pole and around Antarctica at the South Pole, right? And so this is ocean water that has frozen in place to turn into a layer of ice that's usually no more than, a few meters thick, right? And so glaciers and ice sheets can be many kilometers thick, right? Greenland and Antarctica, that's how thick the ice sheets are there. But sea ice is relatively thin. And so sea ice has a much saltier composition than glaciers and ice sheets, which are basically completely fresh and have very little salt content inside them.
Right, but if you have one that comes from snowfall that's right next to, a salty body of water, does the salt wear it away very quickly because it's fresh and the salt water's salty, or what happens?
Yeah, so I think, the difference between a glacier that is in contact with the ocean is basically that there are two ways for it to lose ice, right? So the warm atmosphere can always cause melting at the surface of ice sheets, whether they're on land or in contact with the ocean. But glaciers that are in contact with the ocean, right? The ocean, by definition, is warmer than the melting point of water, right? So if it was colder than that, then it would just turn into ice. But that means that because ice in contact with the ocean is inherently colder than the ocean that it is in contact with, there is going to be a transfer of heat from the relatively warmer ocean to the ice. And so this is a major way in which heat is basically being transferred into ice and causing melting. And in particular, in places like Western Antarctica, where we've seen a really large increase in the rate of ice loss from glaciers over the last 30 or so years, almost the entirety of that increase in ice loss is due to changes in how much or how quickly the ocean is melting the ice sheet. Whereas in Greenland, the increase in melting that we've seen over the last half century or so is almost equal parts due to changes in surface melting at the top of the ice sheet and due to changes in the rate of ocean melting of the ice sheet.
I don't know, like, do you have to treat these two types of glaciers very differently, or they're pretty much the same, even though they're adjacent to different things?
We tend to use the same models to model land terminating glaciers and or what we call marine terminating glaciers. I would say the big difference. So again, when I talk about models, what I'm talking about is like computer models or numerical models, right? And again, backing up a little bit, the main thing that I work on and that my group works on is developing better computer models which describe how glaciers respond to climate change, and how the ice flows and how the ice breaks in its natural environment. And so I would say the main distinction is there tend to be different models for the small glaciers that you find in mountainous regions in places like, the Cascades in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, or the European Alps or the Andes in South America, or the Himalaya, right? So these are what we would call mountain glaciers. And these tend to be quite a bit smaller, and mostly they do not terminate in the ocean. And so their main way of losing ice is through melting at the surface when the atmosphere gets warmer. They also tend to have some, more complicated things going on with them because they're in mountainous environments, and so sort of have to take into account all the effects of like weather and climate in mountainous regions, which can be complicated. And so there's one set of models that are generally used for these mountain glaciers. My group doesn't work on those models as much. But then there's a different set of models that are mostly intended for glaciers, the really big glaciers in places like Greenland and Antarctica, and which are coming to be, now the largest, contributors to ongoing sea level rise. And so with these models, we have to take into account what's called surface mass balance. So surface mass balance is basically the net rate at which ice is being added or taken away from the surface of the ice sheet, right? So snowfall in these regions is always adding more snow, which then over time compresses into ice, as I said before. But in warmer months, in summer months, or what we call the melt season, the atmospheric temperature can be warm enough that it causes melting, right? So that process has to be taken into account, and we have to build a way for the computational models of glaciers to talk to computational models of the atmosphere, right? To, which calculate things like the temperature of the atmosphere and humidity, et cetera. But our models also have to take into account how these ice sheets and glaciers talk to the ocean, right? And also computational ocean models. Like I was saying before, ultimately the rate at which the ocean is melting glaciers and ice sheets has to do with the difference in temperature between the glacier and the ocean, and also the sort of how vigorous the ocean currents are at the interface between the glacier ice and the ocean. And so a few of the projects that my group is working on now is really focused on this question of the heat flux between glaciers and the ocean, how we represent it in computational models, but also doing experiments, like actual real experiments in a laboratory here at Georgia Tech with a collaborator of mine who is an experimental fluid mechanic, looking at the details, like the really fine scale details at like millimeter scale of how heat and salt are moving back and forth between salty water and glacier ice. So these are all things that, are taken into account in these models to varying degrees of success. We know that some of these representations of these processes in these models sometimes doesn't quite reflect what's going on in the real world. And so we have plenty of work to do, and plenty of work for me and my students and my postdocs to be working on to try to improve how these computer models are doing in representing what's going on in the real world.
Do glaciers create a microclimate around them? Or do they have to be a certain size? And if so, what kind of microclimates do they create, and how do they affect, the air and the land and the weather around them directly?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is definitely yes. And even at a small scale, so going back to these, smaller mountain glaciers, at a very basic level, if you paint the surface of the Earth white, it reflects a lot more sunlight back out to space than if the surface is brown or green or, something like that. So just having a glacier on the surface of the Earth, right, that's immediately going to change how much energy the surface of the Earth retains. As those glaciers start to change, and as, let's say, there starts to be more melt at the surface of those glaciers, then you get these melt ponds that form at the surface of these glaciers, and that those melt ponds are darker and they absorb more solar radiation, right? So they very much aren't just affected by the climate, but they also, affect the climate around them. They also just have very different sort of roughness properties, like that they're very different than the land that would be there if a glacier didn't exist. So the way that the wind moves over them is very different. But in particular, in places where you get the really big glaciers or, the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, right? You have these ice sheets which are many kilometers thick. And it's sort of like building a mountain range that wasn't there, a relatively large, smooth mountain range that wasn't there. Now the wind has to flow over that mountain range, right? Or that has to flow over that ice sheet. It is fluxing heat between the surface of that ice and, the properties of how heat it moves between icy surfaces and sort of solid Earth surfaces is very different, right? And also, as things from the atmosphere start to get deposited on the ice to make it potentially darker than it would otherwise be, that also affects, again, how much solar radiation is being reflected by the icy surface. So there is a really complicated, and wide-ranging set of interactions between the whole climate system, but in particular the atmosphere and glaciers and ice sheets. And so, you have to have a pretty good understanding, and that's kind of what our field is engaged in, building our understanding, building the mathematical tools that we have to describe how climate affects glaciers, but also how glaciers and ice sheets affect the climate. Right? So it has long been the case in these big climate models that are used to project future climate change, that they treated glaciers by like just painting the surface white. So you just take your normal model and then you say, well, wherever there's a glacier or an ice sheet, we paint the surface white, and then otherwise we don't really take that glacier and ice sheet into account. And now that glaciers and ice sheets are changing so quickly, there's an increasing recognition that it is important to sort of include the effects, all the different kinds of effects of glaciers and ice sheets on the climate system, and how those effects might change as glaciers shrink in size in order to get the climate right and in order to get sort of the climate of the future right.
What happens to glaciers during storms? Let's say it's like pouring rain. Does it really materially affect a glacier, or is there so much of it that there's nothing that's noticed? And what events really break down glaciers, and which ones build them up climatically?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So it was really long thought that until maybe the last 10 or 20 years, that glaciers did not care about weather, right? And so when I say weather, I mean, like things that happen on time scales of less than a few months. And that, glaciers were really just so the idea was that glaciers are just responding to these slow changes in climates over time scales of like years to decades to centuries. And recently that has changed a lot. And partly that's because we have gotten so much better at observing and measuring, what is happening at glaciers in real time. In faraway places like Antarctica and Greenland. But also there have been some pretty spectacular events that have occurred since we have turned on our satellites in the late 70s, and since we've gotten a lot better at measuring glaciers in field expeditions. And so examples of that are actually just last year, there was an event in East Antarctica, which is actually the part of Antarctica that is generally thought to be quite stable and unchanging, or historically that's how it was thought. And so in East Antarctica, there was this ice shelf called Conger Ice Shelf, and Conger has been stable and existing for, I think people think it's at least a few thousand years. And there was this atmospheric river event. And so an atmospheric river, people might be more familiar with them on like the west coast of the United States, where atmospheric rivers bring a lot of rain and moisture and relatively warm temperatures to places like California, the Pacific Northwest, and the Pacific coast of Canada. But atmospheric rivers are actually everywhere globally. And they also affect Antarctica, right? So Antarctica is a place that, because it's surrounded by a kind of protective rim of sea ice and the Southern Ocean, tends not to get a lot of warm air coming from lower latitudes, from mid-latitudes of the equator. But these atmospheric rivers basically can kind of penetrate this protective shield of the Southern Ocean and bring quite warm temperatures and a lot of moist air to the ice sheet. So there was this large atmospheric river event, which brought record temperatures to the Concordia base in East Antarctica. That it was the highest temperature that they had ever recorded there in, I think, over 50 years of having atmospheric measurements. And within about 2 weeks of that happening, this ice shelf, it's relatively small ice shelf, I think some few hundred kilometers square. That's small for Antarctica. This ice shelf also broke up within a period of a few weeks. And we've only ever observed one other ice shelf collapse like that. So in 2002, there was a very famous ice shelf collapse called Larsen V ice shelf, and this was also observed by satellites. Which is part of the reason why it was so famous, because the pictures of its collapse were, on the front pages of newspapers. And this is an ice shelf that was about the size of Rhode Island. And it collapsed in about 5 weeks. Again, after a very unseasonably warm summer, right? So this is, an event that's occurring on really short timescales due to, historically warm temperatures in the region, that it's in. And these are, things that are happening very quickly, right? And so I think that's, that kind of is one of the ways in which our thinking has evolved in the last 30 or so years, that it was, previously thought that ice sheets really don't change on timescales of less than like a few centuries, that they're relatively stable. But when the Earth's climate changes, then they change slowly in response to that change in climate. And really, since we've had really good ways for looking at the polar regions, the hard-to-reach polar regions, predominantly through satellites, what we've seen is that actually ice sheets are really dynamic places. And when the temperature starts to get warmer over them, they can undergo some, very abrupt and catastrophic changes.
What's the nature of the ice, on the outer edge of a given glacier versus if you drill into it internally? How does it change, and what's the implication for the structure of a glacier?
Glaciers are kind of like layer cakes. So at the surface, you have kind of fresh snow that's sort of like the frosting, in this analogy, the frosting of the glacier. Fresh snow is relatively, is relatively light. So fresh snow has about 1/3 of the density of glacier ice. And so when fresh snow falls, it's relatively light. It has a lot of pretty large pores in between the crystals of the snow, the grains of the snow. And then over time, as more snow piles up on top of that in sort of year after year of snowfall, that relatively light snow gets compressed into what we call firn. So firn is sort of an intermediate state between snow and glacier ice. And so it has something like twice the density of snow. It's a lot denser. The pores are a lot closer together. And as snow turns into ice, or it turns into firn, as the pores get smaller in between the grains of snow and the grains of firn, it locks in the bubbles of air that were existing at the time when that snow was deposited. And so many people in my field will go and they will drill these cores of ice out from ice sheets, and some of these cores can go multiple kilometers down into the ice sheet, even until, all the way through the ice sheet until they hit the solid Earth. And the reason why they drill these cores is because as through this process of transformation from snow to firn, and then finally the glacier ice, which has, is very dense, has triple the density of fresh snow, those gas molecule or those gas bubbles get locked into the ice, and then you can melt those, that part of the ice and analyze the chemical composition of the gas that's released when you melt it. And so this is a whole field of ice core geochemistry that people drill these cores, and then they measure the composition as you go through the cores. And by measuring the composition, you not only know what was in the atmosphere, what kind of gases were in the atmosphere at the time when that snow was deposited on the surface of the ice sheet, but also you could know things like what was the temperature of the atmosphere, because certain isotopes of oxygen change as the temperature at which they were evaporated changes. And you could also reconstruct things like what was the typical snowfall from year to year at the time when the snow was deposited. So this ice core science, has now been around for quite a while, since the middle of the 20th century, and it has really revolutionized the way that we understand Earth's history. So it tells us about the ice sheet, but it also actually tells us a lot about the Earth's climate over really long timescales, like millions and millions of years timescales.
With techniques like cryo-EM, is there a way to keep the ice as ice and maybe make it even super cold, the dry ice, and prepare it, to be used in a high-power microscope to see its structure without melting it? Has anyone done that?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that's done. Usually the melting and then the analysis of it is sort of the last stage of the process. So there's a lot that's done before you melt it and measure the chemical composition. So yeah, you can X-ray the ice core, and that helps you to understand a lot of things. You can sort of hit it with some ionizing radiation, and that tells you a lot about the composition as well. So yeah, there's all kinds of techniques, and honestly, this is not an area that I'm a super expert in. But over the last, 60 or 70 years, folks in the ice core community have developed like really amazing techniques to measure just about everything that you want to measure about the ice, both in non-destructive ways, but also then ultimately you'll get the best information by actually measuring, the content of what's inside. But a lot of the innovation has also been in being able to make measurements about the chemical composition with smaller and smaller samples, right? So there are these ice core repositories all over the world where they have these ice cores that were drilled like decades ago. And these are obviously, it is, as you can imagine, incredibly labor and time and cost intensive to go down to Antarctica and take a 3-kilometer long core of ice. And so these cores are really used very conservatively, and they can take very small strips out of them and make measurements of the chemical composition based on really, really small sample sizes, preserving most of the core for future science. And so so there's definitely been a lot of developments in techniques to make the most out of these ice core archives.
Has anyone looked to see if there's particular animals or fish that live adjacent to the edge of a glacier where it meets a body of water? Are there unique life forms that tend to hover right at the fringe there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole subfield, basically, of like polar marine ecology that is just looking at all of the biological communities that exist around and underneath ice. So yes, there are, where glaciers come into contact with the ocean, the glaciers are melting, but they also are discharging water from their base, because in places like Antarctica and Greenland, ice sheets have pervasive water at their base. And depending on where that water comes from, it's been running through lots of mineral-rich soils. It just could be in contact with bedrock with varying compositions. And so you have this very nutrient-rich water which is being discharged at the edge of ice sheets, which, critters love. And so these are really rich biological communities around ice sheets that have all kinds of interesting and unique animals that are living there. In recent years, the sort of exploration technology has gotten really great, so that we now are sending robots underneath the floating parts of ice sheets. So in places like Antarctica, you have these glaciers which are on the solid Earth, and then they're flowing towards the ocean, and then when they meet the ocean, they start floating. And so you have these places where you have 500 meters of ice, and underneath it, you have another 500 meters of ocean. So these are called ice shelves. And in the ocean cavities that are beneath these thick ice shelves, you have these really, unique biological organisms, fish, all kinds of critters living on the seafloor, but also you have animals that are living in the ice right at the interface between the ice and the ocean, where they can kind of really take advantage of the energetic differences between the ice community and the ocean community. So you have all of these, and in recent years, we've been sending robots, or, people in my field have been sending robots underneath the ice and with cameras on them, and they see all of these amazing animals. But some of the most amazing things I think that have been seen is that in the last decade or so, we've drilled into isolated lakes underneath the grounded ice, right? So this is not where you have floating ice on top of the ocean, like I was just talking about, but on the parts of the ice sheet that are 100 kilometers away from the ocean, right? So inland from the ocean, the ice is in contact, with the solid Earth underneath it. And in some places, you have these subglacial lakes that exist underneath. We've known about these subglacial lakes for a while now, for a few decades, but we're mapping more of them every year. And so you have these isolated lakes underneath ice sheets, far away from the ocean. And in the last decade or so, the first expeditions drilled into these lakes, and they found living things in these places, and different living things than we really see from any other, place on the surface of the Earth, because they have these, really interesting, unique, biological niches, that don't exist really anywhere else. And so we've learned a lot about biology, and so, how evolution occurs in these kinds of environments by looking at what kind of organisms live in these environments.
Okay, well, very good. Alex, what's the best place for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
Yeah, well, you can go to my group's website. Well, if you Google my name, I'm the first person that comes up, but the group that I run at Georgia Tech is the GT Ice and Climate Group. So if you Google that, you'll find my group's website, and you can read all about our research and see videos and pictures of the kinds of things that we do. And then you can also find me on Twitter, at Ice Climate, and where I talk about, new papers that come out from my group, and also what kinds of things my colleagues are working on. So you can absolutely find me there and keep up with our work.
Maybe a handle on Twitter should be like Dr. Freeze or something.
Yeah. I got to think of some more branding opportunities, I think.
Right on. Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are one or two useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe, and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.